Hello, hello, hello. Get rid of that music. How's everybody doing out there? Everybody have a good Thanksgiving? I hope so. I hope everybody ate lots of really, really good food. Um, so about what, two weeks, 2 weekends ago, something like that. Modern Day Debate had their I don't know if I can't remember if it's annual or twice annual. Their their DebateCon conference, which I think is cool. I've been to one. It's a really, really good time. And this one was DebateCon 6, I believe. And there was a debate that was announced, I think, about a week or two before the conference actually happened, on the topic, does God exist, between, as I'm sure you can see here, Mike Jones from Inspiring Philosophy and Richard Carrier. This was one that I was really, really looking forward to. This was one that I was wanting to see. Naturally, I waited until it was posted. I think it posted last Tuesday or Wednesday, something like that is when it got posted. And I did watch it, so I have seen this, and I want to just kind of talk about this debate, go over it. I think it was a good debate. I think it was civil. But there's just some things that caught my attention that I want to discuss, and that's what we're going to do here today. So all of you people fat, full of turkey, can sit back and relax, and we will ask ourselves the question of whether or not God exists.
All right, thank you, James, and thank you, Dr. Carrier, for agreeing to the debate. I'll be arguing that God does exist, and we have more than enough evidence to establish this. I'll present 3 arguments for God's existence, and then make an argument from parsimony. But first, I'm going to argue idealism is true, which in a nutshell is the belief that all is fundamentally mind. We can infer this from what I would call the introspective argument. Okay, premise 1, the mind exists. No one with a mind can doubt this. As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Premise 2, the mind and the properties of mind cannot reduce to matter. The hard problem of consciousness exists for a reason. There is no path forward to explain how consciousness could emerge from matter. Plus, everything we experience is qualia. Take bundle theory, for example, which is that physical objects exist as bundles of properties. For example, you could describe an apple as red, round, shiny, smooth, and tasty. But if you remove these properties, what is left? Well, nothing really. But these are all mental experiences, not physical. As Susan.
So right off the bat, and I like, because I don't know what they have, like, to 10, 12, 15 minutes for an introductions here. But I am myself a bundle theorist. I hold to the idea of bundle theory. I think this is an okay way to talk about bundle theory. What objects are just bundles of their properties. If you took all of the properties away from an object, you wouldn't still be left with like some bare propertyless object. You wouldn't have the object at all. I don't think that these properties are just mental content. I don't think that at all.
Susan Schneider says,
I don't know if most bundle theorists would think that, honestly.
Pure property ontologies need to take physical objects as metaphysically derivative, even objects that physics regards as fundamental. Objects are instead bundled out of properties, or they are properties. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel had to admit, if a mental event really is a physical event in the sense and nothing else, then the physical event by itself, once its physical properties are understood, should likewise be sufficient for the taste of sugar, the feeling of pain, or whatever it is supposed to be identical with. But it doesn't seem to be. It seems conceivable for any physical event. There should be a physical event without any experience at all. Experience of taste seems to be something extra continually related to the brain state. But we can't reduce the physical to the mental, because as we noted, everything we experience is mental. And using the logic of bundle theory and the binding problem, we can infer what constitutes as the physical can reduce to the mental. But as noted, the mental cannot reduce to the physical.
I'm not much for using the term reduce. I think that the mental emerges from the physical. That's the way I would word it. But at least thus far, I don't think that an argument has been given for why I should think that the mental can't reduce to or emerge from the physical. Why? Because Thomas Nagel said so? I don't care what Thomas Nagel said. He was dumb, and I know more than him.
Premise 3, substance dualism is false. As noted, there is no reason to posit a substance beyond the
me and Mike agree there, don't we?
qualia we experience. And substance dualism suffers from issues like the interaction problem. Therefore,
this is why, holy shit, excuse me. Pardon me, I'm just dying over here. Oh, fuck. So I have actually maintained for probably a few years now. This is one of the reasons why I absolutely like. It wouldn't even have to be a debate, but just to have a discussion with Mike, I think would be really interesting because me and him actually have quite a bit of agreements in the area of metaphysics. We both accept bundle theory. We both think substance dualism is false. We're both ontic structural realists. I believe, if I remember correctly, I've heard Mike describe himself as ontic structural realist, which is just a particular form of scientific realism and realism about the external world, that there really is an external world. It exists independently of our experience of it. Science can tell us actually true things about that actually real reality, and that it is primarily a world of structures and relations. That's sort of the idea behind ontic structural realism in sort of a real quick rundown. I'm very, very certain that I've heard Mike advocate that, and that's why I think it would be interesting is that me and him have a decent amount of like agreements with respect to our metaphysical views of the world, yet we come to completely different conclusions about the world metaphysically. And I really do think that me and him could have a quite an interesting discussion.
From the three premises, the conclusion would follow that all is mind, and that would mean idealism is true. If idealism is true, then our background knowledge makes it more likely that theism is true, and this will become apparent as I go through the three arguments. First, by God, I just want to say I mean a necessary immaterial mind whose nature would be ideal or absolute perfection. So the first argument is called the emergent universe argument.
See, one thing so I'm going to back this up and let that play again, just because I think it's important here.
First, by God, I just want to say I mean a necessary immaterial mind whose nature would be ideal or absolute perfection.
So I think that by defining God this way, what Mike has done here is he's opened himself up to a number of objections that aren't necessarily directly related to the arguments he laid out, but that would still be, in my opinion, some form of undercutting defeater for his view. You could attack this idea that God's existence is necessary. You could attack the concept of immateriality, and you could attack the concepts of this notion of ideal or absolute perfection. You could even go after the notion of creating the universe and how that doesn't seem to be a very consistent idea. And these aren't, they're only at very best tangentially related to the actual arguments that Mike is laying out, insofar as that his arguments, their conclusion, at least corroboratively, is the existence of this God. And this is something that, as you will see, unfortunately, I don't think Dr. Carrier really jumped on. Not that I would have focused that much on it, because I find Mike's arguments interesting, and I would have actually wanted to talk about the arguments. But I do think that this definition of God here is certainly one that opens Mike up to a variety of objections about that kind of God.
So the first argument is called the emergent universe argument. So if the universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. The universe is emergent, therefore the universe is emergent from a mind. Pretty simple. I'll start by defending the second premise. The common belief today is the universe is fundamentally like particles or something like quarks, but quantum field theory doesn't show that. Physicist Walter Schmidt says particles are actually waves in different types of fields. This goes for all the particles we are made of. We are all just made of waves in a field. What looks to us as a billiard ball on a billiard table is actually a bunch of waves moving from the cue to the pocket. Now, some try to say, well, everything might reduce to quantum fields, but that doesn't work either, as the philosopher of physics David John Baker notes, that many of the problems that particle interpretations have also apply to field interpretations. And as other experts have noted, Baker's conclusions are pretty decisive to this day. Now, this can get complicated, but experts have noted Baker's conclusions are pretty decisive to this day.
I don't know if most philosophers of physics accept that. I think there are some. Most of them will acknowledge that. So when he talks about like problems with particle interpretations and field, I read that paper by Baker probably 4 years ago at this point now. I haven't really looked at it since, so I'm not going to like confidently comment or speculate on it because I'm really working from memory. So one of the primary problems with a field interpretation, as it would be called, is this idea that like we get all these infinities when we describe things in terms of fields. A lot of these field theories have to be renormalized, is a word you might hear, which is a mathematical tactic to control for those infinities. The thing that one needs to understand is these are problems with like the mathematics and the ways that we interpret what reality is doing, but that doesn't mean that they're problems for the reality itself. They're problems with how we interpret and understand it through the variety of conventions that humans have developed over the years for understanding these things. So there might be problems with the ways that we interpret reality, but that doesn't mean that they're problems for reality. So reality can still be fundamentally physically constructed of fields, despite the fact that the mathematical methods we use for understanding their mechanics and their dynamics and their interactions might have problems with it. I don't think most philosophers of physics would probably agree with the conclusions of Baker's paper. Though I'm not going to say that I'm confident in that answer. I don't think it poses any real issues for this notion that quantum fields are a properly fundamental, physically real feature of the external world.
Now, this can get complicated, but in a nutshell, there are mathematical problems with saying quantum fields are underlying objects, like the inability to assign Fock space to quantum fields, and other issues like spontaneous symmetry breaking. As Baker concludes, it seems that in many ways, fields and particle interpretations must stand or fall together.
Well, I mean, but they kind of do. Like, the particles and fields are two different ways that we can understand the fundamental nature of reality. Fundamentally, they are fields. There is some sort of potential that can be described across all moments of space-time. And we can represent the energy present in these fields as being particles, despite the fact that that's frankly really just sort of a convention. But this doesn't really bear on the nature of physical reality itself. Again, it's just problems with our mathematical methods for understanding it.
Next slide. So just appealing to fields to escape the problems that show particles cannot be fundamental doesn't work because a lot of the same issues come up. Philosopher of science Minor Coleman notes physics lacks a coherent account of fundamental issues, such as the definition of objects. And it's not at all clear what a particle or field even is. Quantum field theory doesn't suggest fields are entities. Instead, at the most
they're entities, yes.
Fundamental level, we only find structures, relations, and properties.
Yeah, those can be understood as entities. Like, I agree with this. I don't think quantum fields are made up of something. I don't think they're constituted by something or constructed of some more underlying material or something like that. I think they are largely structural and relational entities, but they are still physically real entities. They are still properly fundamental. And we still have problems mathematically describing them and their dynamics. We don't have the whole picture figured out here. So again, I don't see this as necessarily being problematic to any sort of like physicalist view with respect to quantum field theory.
Not a material substance there. So this is one reason physicist James Glatfelter says the very notion of materialism now appears misguided. Our worldview is shattered. Philosopher Jan Westerhoff agrees. The moral to draw from the reductionist scenario seems to be that either what is fundamental is not material or that nothing at all is fundamental. And I'm citing so many experts so you're aware this is not something I made up. It's coming from experts in the philosophy of physics. Essentially, our macro reality appears to be emergent from underlying information, not fundamental objects that we can call fields or particles, thus supporting the second premise. Now, as for the first premise, if all of material reality can reduce to mathematics, properties, and abstractions without any reference to a substance, then it can better fit with an idealist worldview, where the macro reality is merely emergent from.
So there is a view in like in metaphysics, and it kind of leans in a little bit to the philosophy of physics that takes information as being fundamental. I think it's called informational structural realism. I don't hold the informational structural realism. I don't think it's like a ridiculous view or anything like that. It's just not a view that I hold to. I think that one could hold to it and still be some sort of physicalist or naturalist, where information is some sort of physical or natural entity. The word material really is not used very commonly much by metaphysicians or philosophers of physics working in this area. They're going to use terms like physicalism or naturalism, or they're going to refer to things as physical or natural rather than material. And that's just because the word material has a lot of historical baggage associated with it and might often imply things that aren't necessarily captured by what our fundamental theories are saying.
Information contingent on mind. Instead of positing an undetectable material substance to give rise to quantum fields and particles and then somehow builds conscious agents, we stick with what we know exists: consciousness and a material reality reducible to information. So shave off all mind-dependent objects and stick with what we know. Similarly, philosopher Doreen Fraser has to say about our reality: multiple lines of argument support the conclusion that quantum field theory does not describe a world that contains particles as fundamental entities. These arguments rely on special relativistic or general relativistic premises. I've added the proposal that particles be considered fictions in another sense. Particles and quasi-particles in condensed matter physics supply physical intuitions that are useful for formulating mathematical framework for quantum field theory, but which do not represent the world even approximately.
Well, number one, that's I just disagree with that. I think most physicists would disagree that particle interpretations don't even capture the world approximately. I think that they do, but with the sentiment that's being expressed here is more something along the lines that particles just reduce to the dynamics of fields. Fields would be fundamental. Particles are just these sort of conventional ways that we can talk about what it is fields are doing and how it is fields do those things. But the particles themselves are not fundamental. The particles themselves are not like the main event, so to speak. The main event would be the fields themselves, and particles are a way of talking about what the fields do.
So no need
and they do approximately capture the behavior of fields, which is why physicists to this day talk about fields in terms of their particles or even their virtual particles in order to describe and understand and explain the dynamics of these fields.
Posit some sort of substance beyond that. We stick with an idealist ontology. Mind is fundamental, and the physical is just information or qualia. Next, we can use another correlation using quantum cognition, and this will be an inductive argument. In 2009, physicist Diedrich Erch published a paper noting that our cognitive processes can be readily modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. Now, this is not just hypothetical. Psychologists have been applying quantum cognition to their field and finding it is more successful than traditional models, and has provided principled answers to the puzzles and challenges. My opponent knows of quantum cognition is independent from quantum mind research, and he's endorsed the field recently. However, the point I'm getting at is that if our inner mental...
Quantum cognition is a legitimate thing, but it's more this idea that what we're doing is we're taking sort of the mathematics that is used in quantum theory and applying it to understanding what the brain is and how cognition works and all that, rather than taking the physical principles, quantum physics, and applying it to the brain. So that's, I think that's a meaningful distinction that needs to be made, is that it's the mathematical principles that are being applied, not the actual physics that you would do in quantum physics to understanding various cognitive processes and things like that.
Mental world can be modeled in terms of quantum processes, similar processes that give rise to space-time and matter. That means space, time, and matter are emergent from the underlying quantum. The mental world can be modeled in terms of quantum processes.
Well, if by quantum processes we mean some sort of like mathematical framework that we use for understanding the cognitive processes, yes. If you mean quantum processes as in quantum physical processes, then no.
Similar processes that give rise to space, time, and matter.
Well, we don't know. I mean, space-time probably is an emergent structure. I think it probably is, but we don't know that. So we don't know what quote-unquote processes would potentially give rise to space-time. We understand pretty well the processes that give rise to matter and the interactions, but to space-time, that is not, as far as I understand, been worked out yet.
That means space, time, and matter are emergent from the underlying quantum world, but our inner mental world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes. But our inner mental world, that means space, time, and matter are
from quantum wave. Well, so this is No, I'm not going to say this is necessarily like super controversial to say this. I think a lot of people that hold the many worlds interpretation would say they might not word it this way, but the general sentiment being expressed here is something they would likely agree with. I wouldn't, but that's not because I think that this statement right here is like a controversial or a stupid or an uneducated statement to make. Just that I disagree that wave functions and Hilbert spaces are like physically real objects. I think both of those are just mathematical conventions. I don't think wave functions are things out in the world. I don't think a Hilbert space is an actual physical space that things are extended through. I think these are mathematical conventions humans utilize for understanding the structure and dynamics of the physical world at particular scales.
Are emergent from the underlying quantum world, but our inner mental world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes. Through the study of quantum cognition, this would suggest that what space-time emerges from would be similar or indistinguishable from that of a mind, or something that looks and acts an awfully lot like a mind. But I'd say the most parsimonious explanation is the universe is just emergent from a mind, instead of it emerging from something that isn't a mind, yet resembles and acts like a mind.
My biggest gripe with this argument would be that I take minds to be some sort of processual structure of brains. We don't observe minds absent brains. That's never been a thing that anybody has observed in any meaningful or corroborative way. Everything that we understand about consciousness, not just in humans, but in all the things that we have thus far studied consciousness in, seem to suggest that it is some sort of emergent process arising out of the relations and structures of physical brains, the central nervous system, and its perceptive capabilities with respect to its interaction with the external world. So if you didn't have any of those, I don't think you would get minds. So I take minds to be emergent from physical processes rather than the other way around.
In private correspondence with one researcher in this field, he said it could all just be a coincidence, but the correlations, i.e. the similarity in behavior between human concepts interacting with human minds and quantum entities interacting with fermionic matter, could be caused by the fact that both
quantum entities interacting with fermionic matter. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. Also, the term fermionic matter seems a little, I don't know, it seems a little redundant. Matter is, like, that's, fermions are matter particles. Bosons are not matter particles. They're what are generally referred to as force carriers. I don't know. Massimiliano Sassoli di Bianchi. I don't know who that is.
both entities share the same conceptual nature. This can also be strengthened through the research in quantum mind theory, which I don't have time to cover now. But we can also look through both entities share the same conceptual nature. This can also be strengthened through the research in quantum mind theory, which I don't have time to cover now. But we can also look at the work of astrophysicist Franco Vazza and neurosurgeon Alberto Felitti, who wrote a paper on the similarities between neural networks and the cosmic web of galaxies. And they show that the properties of neural networks within the human cortex are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies.
Oh, shit. Here we go. So I feel like this is just a will brain and cosmos look same, therefore are same kind of argument. Like, okay. I mean, they kind of look the same. The processes clearly are very, very different. The neuronal structure of the brain is not held together via gravity. There aren't vast distances separating it. Like, this is not, that's not, like this is purely an aesthetic, what's the word I'm looking for? An aesthetic similarity.
Properties of neural networks within the human cortex are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies. Something we would expect if the universe is emergent from a mind. This is less likely if physicalism is true, but it would be predicted by.
I don't see why, if idealism were true, that we would expect the cosmos to kind of sort of look like what the neuronal structure of the brain looks like, what the physical structure of the brain looks like at the molecular, or I should say macromolecular scale, or what have you. I don't. I'd like to see the probability calculus on that one.
By idealism. Because, as philosopher of mind Bernardo Kastrup notes after drawing on their works, brains are the images or representations of conscious minds. Elsewhere, he says a brain, or the whole body by extension, is just the external appearance of a conscious agent. The universe.
I think it's really interesting that he brings up Bernardo Kastrup here, because Bernardo Kastrup is an idealist. He's developed what he calls analytic idealism. But if I recall correctly, back in, I think this would have been 2021, maybe 2020, but I think it was 2021. Nathan from Digital Gnosis, which is a channel you should check out, hosted a debate between Bernardo Kastrup. I'm pretty sure might have been James Fodor, but I think it was Nathan, hosted a debate between Bernardo Kastrup and Graham Oppy on idealism versus physicalism. And I remember Bernardo saying something like, where he was asked, I think it was an audience question that got him talking about this, but I do remember him mentioning that initially Oppy wanted to debate idealism versus naturalism, and Kastrup rejected that because Kastrup considers himself a naturalist. He said, "I'm a naturalist. I'm just not a physicalist naturalist. I'm an idealist, but I'm still a naturalist." And so he said, "I would rather debate idealism versus physicalism than idealism versus naturalism, because being an idealist doesn't actually preclude you from being a naturalist. You could think that mind is more fundamental to matter and still think that both mind and matter are natural things. There's nothing inconsistent about that view, at least as the view is expressed in analytic idealism given by Bernardo Kastrup." So I just wanted to mention that, because I don't want anybody thinking that if you were convinced of idealism, or if you thought that idealism might be true, that must commit you to the existence of God, or to the existence of like a fundamental mind that we could call God. No, one could be an idealist and still be a naturalist. And again, if I'm recalling correctly, which I think that I am, Bernardo Kastrup is an idealist and a naturalist.
Universe is emergent from a mind. We would expect the universe would in some way be the external appearance of that conscious agent, in the way your brain on idealism is the external appearance of you. So we have good reason to support the first premise as well. Now, as for the second argument, start here. It's called it's a consciousness argument. Premise one, contingent minds have either a personal explanation or a natural explanation. Theories of mind will fall into one of these two categories, or a mix, I guess you could suppose. And by personal explanation, I mean that if our consciousness cannot be reduced to natural processes or parts, and is irreducible as is, then it must come from a personal source. Premise two, idealism is true.
Well, I mean, property dualists, I don't think, would agree with that. I think they say that perhaps the mind can't be reduced to natural or physical processes or structures or entities or what have you, but that it's not explained in terms of something else with personhood. That the mind just, there's a separate set of properties that distinguish mind from physical things, and those properties simply aren't physical or natural in nature. Hence the term property dualism.
True, and thus all is reducible of mind. There are various ways I could argue for this. I refer you to the prior arguments, but for the sake of time, I need to move on. So this would mean that if all is mind, one's individual consciousness cannot be reduced to natural parts or processes that are not mental in nature, therefore, conclusion one, a natural explanation cannot be the reason for contingent minds. Premise three, the explanation of contingent conscious minds is a personal explanation. And then
so yeah, I would say, I think here in this argument, honestly, I think premise one is just a false dilemma. I don't think personal or natural are the only categories. You could have some non-personal and non-natural set of properties defining what a mind is, like what property dualists generally hold to. And then it just would not fall under either of those. Premise two, idealism is true and the soul is reducible to mind. Okay.
And then the source would be a necessary personal source. Idealist philosophers seem to be recognizing this fact one way or another. Bernardo Kastrup says the whole universe is a mind, but not in your individual psyche alone, for mind extends far beyond the boundaries of personal introspection. Helen Yetter-Chapel says external reality is a vast unity of consciousness independent from all finite minds. But this would lead to a theistic conclusion. If all is mind,
I don't think that's true. By the way, I think it's worth noting idealism is not popular amongst metaphysicians.
and yet we are individually contingent, then we still must come from somewhere, but we as conscious agents are irreducible to smaller parts that make up our consciousness, it would reasonably follow our minds come from a greater mind that is the grounding of all contingent minds. Therefore, this is who we would call God, therefore God exists. Now, the final argument I'll present is the moral argument. Premise one, non-natural moral realism is true. This is the view that moral facts exist objectively and are not reducible
And I would just reject that premise.
to natural properties like happiness or anything in nature. They cannot be natural because of issues like the is-ought problem or G.E. Moore's open question argument. Something that is in nature is not evidence of something we ought to do. But as numerous philosophers note, moral realism is intuitive. And
I want to show something quick just so that I can really drive the point home here, because I think it's worth doing so. And this is the 2020 Phil survey, and let me zoom in here. I selected specifically metaphysicians because I think that they're the ones that sort of are thinking about these kinds of things the most. Maybe epistemologists would be a good one to look at as well, but you can see there's idealism, skepticism, or non-skeptical realism. And I mean, yeah, like, look, I'm not going to say it's wrong to be an idealist. I don't think it's wrong to be an idealist. I don't think it's dumb or stupid, but I do think it's something worth considering and, talking to people about. I don't think it's like, oh God, that's just absolutely ridiculous. How could anybody ever believe that? But it's not popular. It's not popular amongst people, particularly the relevant philosophers who are thinking about these things. It's but by far not, it's a very, very unpopular view. And I think that that's somewhat relevant to the discussion.
And the way that moral values and duties manifest in reality implies they are objective. So, moving on.
Wait, hold up.
Ought to do. But as numerous philosophers note, moral realism is intuitive, and the way that moral values.
I don't think that moral realism is actually all that intuitive.
And duties manifest in reality implies they are objective. So, moving on, premise two, if objective moral values and duties exist, they are personal in nature. Take moral prescription.
Perhaps, I mean, there's moral realists that would reject premise one. There are naturalist moral realists. So,
they do not exist in physical nature. The natural world only contains descriptions. Prescriptions exist between minds. I could prescribe you the task of guarding me at this event, but that prescription exists between two minds. So if we are bound to objective prescriptions, that implies they come from a prescriber. As Peter S. Williams says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, e.g. the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are fundamentally obligated. Take the moral ideal. If there is an objective moral ideal, you will picture an agent who always acts right and is perfectly virtuous. But that is necessarily an agent, not mere abstract principles divorced from something personal. If there is an objective ideal, it would be a perfect moral agent. From a perfect mind would come perfect principles of behavior.
Yeah, and what Mike has done right here is open himself up. When did we change? There we go. Has opened himself up to arguments from evil, particularly the logical argument from evil.
Here, take moral guilt. Peter S. Williams says, since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract, impersonal moral principle, and since it is appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, that moral law cannot be an abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality before whom it is appropriate to feel moral guilt.
So if objective moral truths are grounded in God's nature, either A, they're grounded in the stances, the preferences of God, and they are thereby normative, but then that's just a subjective morality because all moral statements, the truth of moral statements does not extend beyond mere preferences. Just because it's God's preferences doesn't make them not preferences. And so that would just be a form of subjectivist morality. Now, one might say, well, but no, they're grounded in just God's perfect nature. Well, then this is just to say that they're grounded in some descriptive fact about God. And if that's the case, then they're not normative, they're descriptive, a distinction that Mike has already talked about. And at that point, then there are no prescriptions to be made, and it's not a moral system. Now, I don't know if Mike holds specifically to like divine command theory or something of that nature, but this idea that objective moral truths are grounded in God's nature either makes morality subjective or it makes it non-normative and thus not a moral system, because at that point, then, if it's not grounded in any normative aspects of God, his stances, his preferences, his desires, what have you, then it's just going to be grounded in some descriptive fact about God. But as Mike has already said, the descriptions are not prescriptions. They don't tell you what you ought or ought not do. And so then you just wouldn't have a moral system, where moral systems are understood as being explicitly normative. And this is the problem with this kind of argument for objective moral value, as being somehow grounded in God's nature.
So the very ontology of objective moral...
It's sort of a type of reductio ad absurdum against those kinds of views about morality.
Moral values and duties are personal in nature. Premise 3, if objective moral values and duties are personal, then they are grounded in a personal source. Premise 4, this personal source is what we call God. Now, it is more parsimonious to posit one entity which encompasses all of objective moral values and duties, rather than multiple ones. So we can simply posit objective goodness itself, which would encompass all values and duties, and that would be personal in nature. Therefore, God exists. Now, I fully expect...
Also, something I think is worth pointing out, parsimony simplicator, like parsimony is what would be considered a theoretical virtue. It's something that we want in whatever sorts of explanations we're adducing to account for whatever it is that we're trying to account for. But parsimony simplicator is not what you want. If you could sacrifice, and parsimony is just sort of this idea that we're not making any unnecessary assumptions. We're making the least amount of assumptions that we can. We're not supposing all this extra stuff just to account for something. But I think that there can be times where maybe you sacrifice a little bit of parsimony, you make some extra assumptions, but making those extra assumptions adds perhaps extensive explanatory scope to the model, or something of that nature, where maybe you do sacrifice just a little bit of parsimony for one or more other theoretical virtues. So parsimony in and of itself is not necessarily the gold standard. Yes, we should be parsimonious, but we should be parsimonious in ways that don't conflict with the other theoretical virtues we seek in our explanations.
I expect my opponent will be able to come up with alternative explanations to the point I raised. But a major obstacle for him is offering an alternative explanation of reality that is more plausible and parsimonious. What I mean is, I suspect he will have an alternative explanation for consciousness, for moral realism. I read his paper recently, and the contingency of the universe. But notice what will happen. He will be demonstrating theism is more parsimonious, because we can explain all of this.
Well, not if you hold the naturalism, because you can account for all of those things under a naturalist view. And naturalism is intrinsically simpler than theism, because it posits at the very least, at the absolute least, one less ontological thing, namely God. Like at the end of the day, there's, like I said, there's at least that one thing that a naturalist doesn't posit that a theist does, and that's God. So naturalism is intrinsically simpler than theism, and if we can provide a naturalist account, an account consistent with naturalism for all of these things, then at that point naturalism would just be the more parsimonious explanation.
All this data,
and I think you can do that. I think that is absolutely a thing that can be done for all of
with one explanation. A fundamental mind exists, which explains why the universe exists, why consciousness exists, why moral realism exists, and many other aspects of reality I don't have time to cover here, like other issues, for example. So theistic idealism has better explanatory scope, power, plausibility, is the least ad hoc. Unless my opponent can offer a simpler explanation that can...
I think theism is quite ad hoc. I don't think that theism has very much explanatory import, because I think theism is ill-defined. And I think that there's a variety of issues with some of these, God being adduced as an explanation for some of these things that doesn't really work in virtue. Like, what is it in virtue of that God does any explaining? Simply saying God explains it because he wants it or he wills it isn't really explaining anything. There isn't any mechanism behind it. God is supposed to causally interact with reality. Well, so what theory of causation are we using? Do we have any examples of this? How is it that we understand the means through which God causally interacts with the world? So I think theism is ill-defined, and I think it for that reason, amongst maybe some others, it lacks explanatory import. It's not good. It doesn't serve as a good, thorough, well-defined explanation for the things that we want explained. At least not as compared to naturalism.
And that can account for all this data I presented, we will have to conclude that theism is the best explanation of reality until we can come up with more data. Now, my opponent has said on his blog that he in articles like The Problem of Nothing and his reply on Kuhn's cosmology, that he thinks an absolute nothing brought about the universe. Not what Lawrence Krauss says, he's very clear about that, but in literal absolute nothing. He says in his blog post, Kuhn's cosmology, whereas if you just let it go without any intelligent control, then a nothing will almost certainly collapse into something. That is absurd, though. That's like saying 0 plus 2 equals a million.
It's kind of silly.
It doesn't make any sense. To collapse into something, it has to be something. He's also said an actual nothing is therefore even more likely to randomly create rabbits and Death Stars in his article, The Problem of Nothing, which is, of course, absurd. That doesn't make any sense. This is what he has offered as an alternative to theism as an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, I guess, or why the universe exists. But this is absurd. He will need to defend this tonight against a theistic proposal, show that is more plausible, more parsimonious, and in fact is logically coherent. Let's remember the Duhem-Quine thesis: no theory can be confirmed in isolation from its background assumptions. If that's one of his background assumptions, he'll need to defend that as a better explanation than theism. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening, Mike. We will kick it over to Dr. Richard Carrier. I have the timer set for you on your first word, Dr. Carrier, for your opening.
All right, first mic check though. Does this sound good? Sounds good. If I sit right here, we're all right. Okay, I'm ready to start.
Perfect.
So the big question here is that we have to start with
something else that I noticed in this debate, just kind of as an aside. It's kind of just a funny little thing that I noticed is Mike and Richard actually sound somewhat similar. Not like very, very similar, but their voices do have a similar cadence to them.
How we decide what is true. So in terms of best explanations, better and worse explanations. So a good explanation will have parsimony, as Michael said. It will have fewer. Parsimony means fewer assumptions. So you're starting with a simpler model to explain more complex models rather than the other way around. Another thing that you're looking at is precedent. What has usually turned out to be the explanation of things? So,
this is actually a really good point that Richard brings up in this debate, and I really wish he would have hammered it home more, because I think it is a very, very, I think it's a very, very important point to finding good explanations, good models, good theories for accounting for the world as it is and as we can understand it.
So for instance, God does not usually turn out to be the explanation of things. No supernatural agent usually turns out to be the explanation of things. When we investigate what explains lightning, evolution, the species of animals, and so on, we always find natural causes. So we should expect natural causes for any future explanation that we haven't caught at yet. Now that doesn't prove it. It's just this is a good explanation. A good explanation builds on precedents that we already have, and it starts with simpler hypotheses than we're trying to explain. And the third principle is that the evidence,
when you take what Richard said, that our experience in literally every instance of meaningful explanations provided for aspects of the world around us, they always turn out to be the result of natural processes, natural structures, natural things. And when you tie that with the idea that naturalism is intrinsically simpler than theism, I think it becomes clear which one is probably not certainly, but most probably the correct view of the world.
the evidence is more likely on your explanation. In other words, if it's exactly what you expect on your explanation, then that's good evidence for your theory. Whereas if that evidence,
I think that relates to consistency, where if the ways, when you take your theory or your model and you try to explain stuff with it, the explanations sort of fit in, like it's what you would expect. We might not understand a variety of aspects of the world, but when we do, the explanations will be the result of natural processes and natural structures and all that stuff. If it's what you would expect, then that says that your model is consistent, and a consistency is another theoretical virtue.
evidence is not quite as expected on an alternative theory, then your theory is better than that other theory. How much better depends on how much the evidence is unexpected on that other theory. That's how you compare quality of evidence. Strong evidence is when the evidence is exactly what you expect on your theory and not at all what you expect on the alternate theory. Small evidence that teeters in a correct direction, one direction, but isn't overwhelmingly powerful. That kind of evidence is maybe slightly expected on the alternative explanation, but it's totally expected on your explanation. So when we do these kinds of comparisons, we want to look for these three things: precedent, simplicity, and how likely is the evidence overall. And we got to bring all the evidence in. We can't leave.
I mean, Richard's case isn't, this isn't the greatest case for atheism or naturalism I've ever heard. It's not the greatest defense, but and you guys know me. I don't think Richard Carrier is like some evil, disgusting, stupid person, but I'm not the biggest fan. I don't think he does horrible in this discussion. There are some points that he brings up that I think are pretty meaningful. Like I said, that concept of precedent. I actually do think precedent is a theoretical virtue. And the thing with, this idea of I don't know if I've explained this. I probably should, just for anybody that might not know exactly what I mean by theoretical virtues. Theoretical virtues are these things that we want our explanations, our models, our theories to have. We want them to be parsimonious, to be as simple as they can be, while still explaining the things we need them to explain, which leads into another theoretical virtue: explanatory scope. What's the scope of the explanation that is provided by these models? How much stuff can this single model be used to explain? The more stuff that can be explained by a single model, generally, the better the model is. Consistency. How consistent is the model? Are the things that we expect given the model what we are actually observing? Does it fit with previous models and the things that we already know are true? Does it fit to the data that we already have? These are things, and then did I already mention precedent? Like Richard said, precedent. What is it that has worked in the past? Those kinds of things. These are what we want our explanations and theories, what have you. These are the sort of, I don't know if you would use the word properties, but these are the virtues we want them to have. This is how we determine good models and good explanations from ones that aren't so good. And there are theoretical virtues that almost everybody in the philosophy of science and in, like, say, the metaphysics of explanation will generally agree upon. And then there's some that others have proposed as theoretical virtues. And maybe there's a little bit more of a discussion about, are those really theoretical virtues, and when they're theoretical virtues versus maybe not being something that we would really need in a model. So I think that there are probably more theoretical virtues than some other people might want to say, but that's just me.
Can't leave evidence out when we ask these questions. So I'm going to test Michael's case using these principles. Also, I should point out that I'm going to defend naturalism. Every time I say atheism, I mean naturalism. I'm not defending supernatural atheisms or any other form of atheism, and that matters because if we define naturalism as the view that mindless natural causes explain everything that happens or exists, then that leads to certain predictions about what can and can't happen and what we can expect and not expect. And that will matter as we continue through this argument. So let's look at Michael's arguments here then. So he starts with this idea of idealism.
The other thing I don't like that Richard does here is this opening statement seems to be more of a rebuttal to Mike's arguments rather than a positive case for naturalism. Here's what naturalism is. Here's why I think naturalism is the better explanation and the better framework for understanding the world around us than theism. That is what your opening statement should be. in a debate, whether it's formal or informal, if you're given some time to sort of give an opening statement, a rough rundown of your view, I think it needs to be a positive case for your view rather than a response to the other view. Because showing that the other view is wrong does not guarantee that your view must be correct unless they're like mutually exclusive views where the falsity of one entails the truth of the other or vice versa, which is usually not the case in a debate. So it's not just about showing that the other side is wrong, it's showing that you are correct. You need to not just tear down the case your opponent gives for their position, you need to build up in its place a positive case for yours. And that's one thing I think Richard does not do in this opening statement that he should have.
That mind cannot reduce to matter. I think what he really means is what we call in philosophy qualia, which is a particular term for what it is like to be conscious. We can explain everything about mind, like thinking and reason and understanding and knowledge and stuff, without reference to qualia. But so I think what he's referring to is qualia, the state of it, the redness of red, the smell of an apple, and things like that. What it's like to be conscious. That his argument is that cannot reduce to matter. Now, I actually, there are several people, Daniel Dennett and Alan Cottrell and Patricia Churchland and many others, Andrew Melnick, Yegwon Kim, and so on, have all argued that you actually can reduce qualia to essentially.
That was actually, I think, a pretty good tactic. I don't know if this is the reason why Richard did this, but I think it was pretty good for him to drop some names. I normally don't think that just bare name dropping is usually a good thing, but in this case, I think it is, because IP kind of did that. I mean, he gave quotes, but then again, it's sort of that, here's a bunch of experts that agree with my position. Well, here's a bunch of experts that agree with mine. And it sort of keeps the positions on much more of an even footing.
Essentially computation.
In terms of their like academic rigor, that there are legitimate experts who hold these positions.
Physics, physical operations of the brain as a computer in a sense. And so we know it's theoretically possible to do this. And I actually do it in a much more specific way, explaining how qualia is an inevitable outcome of processing distinctions in the world. So when you are building a model, when your brain is building a model of the world that you're in, it has to make distinctions between things in that model.
I have to run to the bathroom quick. I'll be back in about a minute or so. I'm going to let this play.
Model, vision, hearing, colors, shapes, distances, and so on. The very fact of computing those things cannot be experienced any other way than as qualia. So that in fact, qualia are an inevitable product of any model computing, which means that certain robots we've built that do this kind of modeling probably also experience qualia. Now, of course, they won't experience in relation to a person, because what we are is a model of ourselves. So, and we have a lot of evidence for this from mind-brain physics about how the model can go wrong, which teaches us what is actually happening in terms of how our mind is building a model. Our brain is building a model of what's going on in itself. The brain is actually trying to model what's going on in itself, and it can make mistakes doing that, and it can make mistakes in a way that only makes sense if what it's doing is trying to build that model and making those mistakes sometimes when it does. So even the relation to yourself, the qualia of consciousness itself, that you are a person seeing a thing and hearing a thing and thinking about other versus you, even that is a product of model building, and there's no other way it could be like than to do that. And maybe we'll get more into that in rebuttals and so on. But that's the basic position I take. And for those who want to find the breadcrumb to begin following all my articles on that, my article Touch All the Way Down is the key article to go for that. And I'm not alone in making these arguments. This is, like I said, so many physicists and philosophers have done this. In fact, most philosophers, according to the latest Phil Papers survey, are physicalists, mind-brain physicalists like
most
me.
by quite a
bit,
bit,
can all
actually.
reduce to matter as essentially in some form an inevitable product of computing. So that gets rid of the first.
And I think I also want to point out, and I was actually just looking at this, I think either last night, most philosophers by quite a bit, by I think somewhere around 30% more, are physicalists over some form of dualist. And that number goes up amongst philosophers of mind. It goes up slightly amongst epistemologists, and I think it goes up slightly amongst metaphysicians as well.
the first part of Michael's argument.
In short, like dualism isn't a very popular view. Yeah, there are philosophers who hold to it. I'm not saying you're stupid if you hold to it. I'm not saying you can't hold to it or that there aren't reasons or arguments to be a dualist. I'm merely saying amongst the experts, and I don't take a consensus in philosophy to be nearly as strong as one in, say, the empirical sciences, because I think a consensus amongst like physicists or chemists or climate scientists or epidemiologists or something of that nature is itself a result of the suite of empirical data corroborating approximately the same conclusions. And then the consensus of the experts is merely a result of that corroborated suite of data and the experts being experts in understanding the field. I don't think that a philosophical consensus is rooted in like empirical data, and so I don't think it's as strong as a consensus rooted in empirical data is. But I think it can be meaningful in showing us, you know, what the actual professional philosophers that study these things and work in these fields and write the books and write the papers, what do most of them think? By a long shot, most of them are physicalists across the board.
Then he gets into the quantum consciousness.
And most of them are atheists and most of them are naturalists as well. So there's that as well.
Argument. Before I get to that, though, I want to bring in evidence that was left out. And this is key here. If we want to understand things correctly, we can't leave evidence out. We got to bring it back in. And when we look at all the evidence, then we can decide what is a better explanation for all that. So if we take the argument from consciousness generally, like the usual version of this argument, if God does not exist, the only way minds could exist is as the output of a complex physical machine that evolved slowly by natural selection over hundreds of millions of years, from ultra-simple worm brains to fish brains to lizard brains, mammal brains, monkey brains, ape brains, hominid brains, and eventually human brains, which is exactly what we observe. The only way consciousness exists on atheism is as complex evolved computers, and we observe complex evolved computers. And we know this because we can take parts out of the brain or deactivate parts of the brain, and we lose the qualia, we lose the consciousness element that it was controlling. So we know the brain is actually generating consciousness as a computation in some sense.
See, I think that there are probably some minorly computational aspects that the brain engages in, but I'm not much for the brain as a computer, consciousness is just a computation sort of analogy or view that a lot of people take. I think Richard kind of takes that view in this debate, if I remember correctly. I don't hold to that. For me, I would say consciousness is physical. I think that it's pretty clear at this point that consciousness is physical, but I think it's also biological. I think it's a biological thing. At least currently, I think it's possible that we could develop technology that is legitimately conscious, that become their own independent agents. Whether we actually ever do that, I don't know, but I think it's entirely possible. But at least as of right now, consciousness is biological.
Now, God would have no need of this. He could just install disembodied minds in our body. No delicate, easily damaged, nutrient, oxygen-hogging brain. We wouldn't need that. It would just be a soul in control of the body. If I was God, I could do that easily, and there would be a lot of actually moral reasons why I would prefer that, to make people that way. And certainly God could make it that way. And the key thing here is, if naturalism is true, we could not be made that way. If naturalism is true, the only way we could be made, and therefore if we wake up in a naturalist world, a world without God, obviously we're there, we're conscious. The only way that could be is if we have a complex machine that evolved after millions and millions of years to produce that thing.
And I actually think that's a really good point, that like, why is it that God created embodied agents that depend on all of these physical aspects and are like, we're nothing but a bunch of fragile meat bags. Like, there's so many things. And, you know, we hear about the fine tuning of the universe, but we can survive practically nowhere in it. We can't even survive ourselves because humans are the special ones. We can't survive on a majority of our planet. Like, why did God make the world this way? Why didn't he just make a world and put disembodied agents in it? Or maybe we're embodied agents, but we don't need food and we can't die and all this stuff. Why? And if consciousness is a non-physical thing and is therefore ignorant to spatial reference, why is it that if I sever my leg, I can't still control my leg? Why does it seem that control of my leg depends on physical connections between my nervous system and my brain and all of that stuff? It seems that if consciousness isn't physical and is therefore not restricted to physical relations purely, that if I had an arm or a leg severed from my body, I should still be able to control it. Why can I not? It seems like it just, if the mind is some non-physical thing, if we were created by God, there seems to be all this extra stuff that just doesn't seem rational for an agent that wants something like us to do. And I think that's a pretty good point for Richard to bring up, that what we observe with respect to what consciousness is, where we see it emerging, the kinds of processes, systems, and structures we seem to see it emerging out of, seems to be what we would expect if, like, the natural world were all that was, and we were just natural agents that evolved within it.
That's the only thing that could exist on naturalism, and yet that's exactly what we observe. Whereas on God, on theism, that isn't the only way we could observe. It's not even the most likely way that we would exist and observe. We would be disembodied minds. And
this is also a really good point. Trent Horn had this point brought up to him, I think, once in a debate with somebody, and Trent Horn calls it the "why not heaven now" argument. But I actually think that obviously Trent, being a Catholic, doesn't agree with the argument, but I think it is a good argument. Why not heaven now? If what God ultimately, truly desired was for agents to be with him in heaven, happy, sin-free, for all eternity, worshiping him and glorifying him, and everybody's happy and it's all hunky-dory and peachy keen, why didn't God just make things that way? Why did he create a universe? Why did he give it a beginning? Why did he have to go back into the universe that he created to fine-tune it because he couldn't create it to be that way to begin with? Why did he create embodied agents? Why did he create predation? Why did he create all of these terrible things and give us the opportunity to sin and do all of this bad stuff and then have to come back in again and save us by coming into human form and dying, but then he didn't really die because he came back from there? Like, it all seems really just a bunch of post hoc rationalizations of the way the world is. But all of the world, but the world being that way seems much more consistent with naturalism. Like, why not heaven now? Click the wrong tab. There we go.
And by the way, if we had that, if we had no brain, we could locate no physical organ whose computations can explain anything we're doing, and yet we're conscious, etc. That would actually be really good evidence for God, or at least the supernatural. And so, but we don't have that. We have, surprisingly, exactly what we would expect if there was no God, which means God had to specifically go out of his way to design the world to look exactly like a world without God in it, which now you have to explain why he would make a strange decision like that. So this is the reason why the argument from consciousness...
Now, I think that's a good point. Obviously, the theist is going to disagree and say that, like, well, but we can see God acting in the world all the time. But the thing that you'll get is, with all these claims of miracles and all this other stuff that God supposedly does in the world, it's dubious or spurious at best. It's not corroborated. It's not well agreed upon. There isn't any empirical data to back it up. It's not testable, or at least has not yet been tested and confirmed repeatedly through rigorous experimentation and observation. It's just, well, but these writings from 40 years after the case say that there were this many eyewitnesses. So then there were that many eyewitnesses, but nobody really knows whether that was the case. Like, it's just, it seems bad. Like, why did God create a world in such a way that it appears as if he doesn't exist?
Consciousness, when you put the evidence back in, actually the evidence is more probable on naturalism than on theism. And therefore, that actually ends up being evidence for naturalism against theism. Now, if we get to the specifics of qualia, all the particulars of qualia, redness, smells, even emotions like awe. I have an article on the evolution of awe on my site. You can check that out for a breadcrumb on that. All the particulars of qualia track specific evolutionary stories confirmed in genetics, animal behavior, and comparative neuroanatomy. So we actually know that there are parts of the brain responsible for generating these kinds of qualitative experiences. And we know they evolved gradually over time, and we know why they evolved, why they got selected to survive and others didn't. Now, qualia come and go with the parts of the brain that generate each in animals as well as humans. And again, in touch all the way down, I show that qualia appear to be the inevitable outcome of computing models. And so we don't really need God to explain any of this, and therefore we don't get the premise that Michael needs on this. When we get to the quantum consciousness argument, I think a lot of that depends on philosophers like Kastrup and those who want to actually follow that up. I have an article on Bernard Kastrup's idealism, so that's a great breadcrumb for you to start into that adventures. Michael's aware of this, and so that's the place I would go. I'm limited on clock, so I can't go into detail on that. But the basic idea is...
Also, for those interested in Kastrup's view, and I would argue a good discussion about them with somebody who rejects them, I would encourage you to look into that debate that I mentioned earlier between him and Graham Oppie. If you just type in Bernardo Kastrup versus Graham Oppie, I'm sure it'll pop up.
If he's starting with the idea that we can't explain what particles are or what waves are or whatever. That's not really inherently a problem in physics because we have lots of theories as to what they are. Just because we don't know which theory is true doesn't mean that we don't have a theory or that we can't explain it. So I'm going to pick an explanation. It doesn't mean I think this explanation is necessarily true. I don't think we proved it yet. My only point in presenting this explanation is to show that we do have possible explanations that could be true. There could be other physical explanations that are true that turn out to be actually true. So I'm just presenting basically a possibility here to show that we actually have possible ways to explain this. And one is if we do superstring theory fundamentally to space-time. In other words, all waves, all particles, etc., actually reduce to waves in space-time through manifolds that are at the Planck scale. They're really small. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. So if you can look into superstring theory, but if you do superstring theory with waves of spacetime, you can end up explaining all the phenomena of quantum mechanics, and therefore all particles, the whole standard model, and so on. And really it comes down to how do things change direction or move, essentially. So for instance, solidity, the table, this thing right here, really this is force fields. We see it as a solid object, but it's actually mostly empty space. And what we're feeling, what's stopping my finger from going through this podium, is actually a force field. And we can explain that. Oh, I have one, thank you. But thank you so much. So we can explain that in physics that way. So we don't actually have this problem that we can't explain particles, we can't explain things. We actually have those things. And a good example is when Michael says that you can reduce things to mathematical formalisms. It's worth pointing out that all mathematical formalisms describe physical behaviors. So really a formalism is just a description of what's happening physically. And that means that the formalism corresponds to some physical thing. So you can't argue from the fact that a mathematical formula describes a thing that there's no physical thing being described. It actually is a physical thing being described. Force fields is one of these. Force fields arising from space-time, warping of space-time at small scales and so on. All of this would work. So there's not really a problem coming up with an explanation. He gave another example of the cosmic web and the mind. This is a thing that, again, I don't have time to go into it in great detail. You can Google this and look into it to find what are the explanations of this. So look for scientists and physicists talking about it, not the sensationalists. And what you'll find when you do that is that it's actually a thermodynamic effect of systems evolving by deterministic physics into the most efficient geometric structures. So the same kinds of thermodynamic action that builds stellar clusters is also pushing the cells of our brain to organize in a certain way, because that's the most efficient way to do the thing that the brain is doing. And when it comes to the arrangement of galaxies in space, it's the most efficient way for the exchange of energy. So it actually just sort of forms that way naturally. It's very similar to the fractal physics that we find in like the formation of trees and the way their branches go, and then compared to the way that coastlines look and so on. It's just deterministic physics actually explains it. There's nothing special about it. And it doesn't mean that the universe is a giant brain or anything like that. It couldn't do that because it doesn't have, information doesn't travel around it fast enough for it to think. So when we look at all of this, we see consciousness is a process caused by physical processes. The history, all of the physics, all of the neuroanatomy, everything we've learned tells us this. And so it is reducible to those systems. There's no reason to believe that it's not. So that takes care of all of that stuff. And I think, is there anything more I want to go into before I continue? No, I think I'll skip. How much time do I have? 1 minute. Okay, the is-ought problem, real quick. We'll get to the lucky God problem later, hopefully in rebuttals. So the is-ought problem, that's actually been solved for a while. This is a misunderstanding of what Hume said. We prove oughts from ises all the time. So like if you want to build a bridge that will stand up, you ought to act a certain ways. If you're a surgeon who wants to save the patient's life,
Yeah, but those are determined based on the preferences we have about the way things are. But they're not derived strictly from the way things are. They're derived from the preferences that we have about the way things are.
you ought to sterilize your instruments. So we can easily reduce oughts to ises. And so the question is, what would be a moral reduction? What would be a moral imperative instead of just these utilitarian imperatives? Moral imperative.
Also, I think anybody who thinks that we can reduce oughts to ises does not understand the fundamental difference between those two kinds of statements.
Imperatives are the oughts that arise from the things that supersede all other imperatives. So empirically proving imperatives is something that we've done. I have a paper on this about all objective moral facts exist in all possible universes. That was published in Religions. Michael referenced that. I would recommend you check that for the complete starter case on it. And it's available free. It's not behind a paywall. Anyway, so the is-ought problem doesn't create a problem for us because empirically proving oughts in science does that all of the time. I have other arguments to make on that, but I think I'm running out of time. Is that the... Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for that opening as well, Dr. Carrier.
Mm-hmm.
We will switch it into the rebuttal mode. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our friends at Maine First Project for sponsoring DebateCon's project is fighting box below.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Carrier. I really appreciate that. I want to start out by saying I know I'm
We got to fight all that evilness in Maine.
totally aware we have a limited time, so I would please press you to use that limited time to offer a better explanation other than just random possibilities. As I said in my opening statement, there are plenty of possibilities we could posit. Why is that a better explanation given the data? If we have different aspects of reality, emergent nature of the universe, contingency, consciousness, moral realism, can even throw in things like fine-tuning or reason, we can explain all that with theism. If we want to posit various different other possibilities, that would be actually conceding, because that's my point. You have to do that, and that just shows that you're not actually offering a plausible and parsimonious explanation. He said supernatural explanation is not an explanation. I want to rebut that by saying, could you define what natural and supernatural are? How do we distinguish this? Because I think
Yeah, natural stuff is just the stuff that is a part of the external physical world we can interact with, and supernatural would be anything that isn't that but somehow still exists, which I take to just be an ill-defined concept to begin with. I don't think it really means much of anything to say that something exists and is supernatural.
I think there's a
But
lot of
this idea that like we can't really define what it means to be natural or supernatural, and we can't meaningfully delineate between, that's bullshit. Yes, we can. Philosophers have been doing that for over 1,000 years.
gray in that, and these terms are not proper.
I feel like I'm not going to say it's being done purposefully. I don't want to. I don't want to say that. At least, certainly not by Mike here. But I think that there's a lot of people who are not naturalists and have gripes with naturalism, or like with physicalism, if somebody uses that term, where they'll try to like. I feel, again, whether or not they're doing it intentionally, I feel it's. What it does is it's a way of obfuscating the discussion to avoid the fact that they, quite frankly, I don't think that they have really good objections to physicalist or naturalist viewpoints on a lot of these things. And so rather than object to the arguments, it's let's muddy the waters about what the terms mean and make this completely unsubstantiated claim that, well, these terms haven't really been well defined and there isn't a meaningful delineation between them. That's just bullshit.
Define. He said physicalist philosophers have argued qualia can reduce to computational physics. I don't think I disagree. I'd like you to explain more on that. My point was that qualia does not reduce to a material substance. So if you have an idealist ontology, we experience qualia, which I would say could be reduced to information. Totally agree. Not a problem there.
What if somebody takes information to be strictly physical?
So I don't see that as really challenging what I said. You said minds can exist out of being complex machines, or they're complex evolved computers on your view. That needs to be justified. We just can't say brain, magic, therefore consciousness. We have the hard problem of consciousness for a reason. If you're going to posit a physical theory, you're not going to say consciousness is fundamental. You need to explain how it emerges. Okay. My argument is that it can't, and it's best explained as a personal explanation.
It emerges as a pattern that is not present in the fundamental systems out of which it emerges. All of the various communications and the structures and the relations built between all of the various parts of the brain that can be defined by all the ion channels and all of that stuff is what consciousness emerges out of. The fact that a non-cognitive scientist, or even if he asked a professional cognitive scientist working at the forefront of this field, even if they couldn't explain every last iota of detail about how consciousness emerges, does not refute the fact that it emerges. I doubt IP could explain how a video emerges out of just mere programming in his PC. But I don't think that he would say that means that you can't. Maybe he would, but I doubt it. That you can't say that the video playing on your screen emerges out of the computational processes and the processes of what your computer is doing. There's a lot of people that wouldn't be able to explain all the details of that, but they could still make the claim that that's what happens.
Explanation because of issues like that, and because the very nature of consciousness cries out for a personal explanation. So we need more than just, well, it happened. I need actual data for that, because there's no evidence that brains are actually generating consciousness. Correlation is not.
Well, I mean, yes, there is, considering that we can, anesthesia works. We can literally just turn it off by affecting only the physical brain. I can completely change the way that you perceive the world around you by feeding you alcohol. And all alcohol does is affect the physical brain. We can see changes in personality, fundamental changes in identity. We can go into the brain and make people angry by only physically affecting the brain. All of these things are perfectly consistent with a naturalist or a physicalist view about the mind, and make quite clear that consciousness emerges out of the fundamental processes and structures of the physical brain, such that when you affect those processes, you can affect consciousness in a variety of ways. We've done it. We do it all the time. This is done consistently by cognitive scientists as they continue to do better in our understanding of what consciousness is and how, on a more precise level, it emerges out of brain activity.
Is not causation. We have correlations in the brain. Idealists.
Well, but they are causal because we've isolated the factors that are responsible for what we're observing, such that we can claim that they're the causes. So it isn't just merely correlative. Obviously, it is correlative because causation is intrinsically correlative, but it's not merely correlative. And asserting that, I don't think, is any sort of objection. We've isolated the variables doing the causing in the most of these instances. So yeah, we can claim that it is causal.
Predict that. Physicalists can predict that. That doesn't change.
I mean, this is like saying that, well, running is only correlated with what the legs are doing, but it's not caused by what the legs are doing. Or saying that, well, digestion is only correlated with what the gut is doing, but it's not caused by what the gut is doing. I think that those statements are equally as ridiculous as saying, well, consciousness is only correlated with brain activity, but we can't say it's caused by brain activity.
Doesn't change anything. Now, we need to talk more about your whole worldview, because you're trying to argue that naturalism is more probable given what we observe. I would argue that on your entire worldview, it isn't. You said in your article, Kuhn's Cosmology, you said this reifies the principle of indifference, but the reification is a logical necessary outcome of the state of nothing as described. It is the absence of all limits and controls. All logical possibilities are ontologically possible outcomes. And in the absence of anything rendering one outcome more likely than another, every outcome must necessarily be equally probable. In other words, because you are arguing from this nothing state, which you've not defended yet here, you have to say, and you've said, everything is equally probable. So how could you say the universe we observe is more probable on your worldview? It isn't. You've said everything is equally probable.
Oh, no. So just with respect to this comment, I wanna respond to this because I respect the person who made the comment. As I understand it, most cognitive scientists would hold to some sort of emergent model of consciousness. I mean, I don't. Whether or not consciousness being emergent is confirmed, I think it just kind of depends on what we mean by confirmed. I think the empirical data is quite clear. Consciousness is a sort of a pattern, a process that arises out of the structures, functions, and relations of a variety of the parts of the brain, but is not itself found in any of the individual parts of the brain, which is in general what people mean by emergence, that you have some sort of pattern that is present as a result of the structures and relations between a variety of more underlying parts, where that pattern is not itself present in each of the individual parts, but arises out of the relations between them. And that consciousness arises as a result of the relations between the parts of the brain, the communication between them, their functions and the structures that are built under these relations between various parts of the brain. And that system, that process that is consistently sustained is what we call consciousness.
So if everything's equally probable, nothing is probable. So you can't say that on your worldview, the universe we observe is more probable. Now, he talked about, well, why did God design the universe this way and not another way? You correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm misunderstanding you there. This flows out of two principles: the nature of God and axiology, which is the study of value. God is going to create value, things that are valuable. Bodies have value.
How do we determine what's valuable? Bodies have value. By what standard? What standard of evaluation are we using to determine that? And this is where it's going to get where a lot of Christians who take who hold to some sort of like axiological realism that value is objective. This is where you get into problems with that. Is okay. So what is the objective standard, that which we use to determine whether something is valuable or not?
Value.
Of course, I don't think there is one.
Creating a universe that slowly evolves or slowly gets better has value. Creating creatures,
again, by what standard?
That can come to learn and study the universe has value in that. God is going to create value, analogous to a author who creates various different worlds and stories. There are value in those. Some may be better than others, some are not. They're still creating value through those stories. God, who is perfectly good, would also want to increase value, and that is what he's doing. He's increasing value in how he's creating. We don't need to posit that he created a certain way or another way. Imagine if, like, to give an analogy, let's say we came across a crime scene and there was a guy there. We found video footage of a murder in the room with him for an hour, and then he stabbed him and walked out. And we're like, well, we know a murder committed. It'd be absurd for us to say, no, because that couldn't have happened. The murderer could have created elaborate saw exercises from the movie and puzzles and schemes and tortured him. Why would he just have stabbed him? It doesn't matter. We may not know the intentions or the thoughts of that murder, but we know a murder happened. Likewise, we have evidence in this universe that God exists. We can point to it. So that still follows. So again, and I didn't say we need God to explain qualia. That was the first initial argument arguing.
I think the objection Richard was making there was more, God doesn't seem to be a good explanation because God doesn't help us differentiate between why the world is the way that it is rather than some other way. And it seems that all Mike's objection to that was, well, because that's the way that God wanted it. Well, but how do you know that? You can't infer from the world being this way that that's the way that God would have wanted it. And I don't think saying, well, that because that's what God wanted, that God wants to do this, and so that's why he did it this way, is a good explanation. I just don't.
Arguing for idealism. So idealism is what I was basically positing. That what we see in terms of qualia, there's no need to posit a physical substance beyond the mind, is my point. A second substance. I'm not a substance dualist. I'm an idealist. All is mind. So I would call myself a dual aspect idealist. You posited superstring theory. Well, that's highly speculative. Physicist Tom Hartsfield has published a lot of articles arguing that string theory is circling the drain. He said this in 2014. It's riddled with problems. But even if string theory turns out to be true, this isn't a challenge to my view, because string theory would be a scientific theory, not a metaphysical theory or hypothesis, if you want to use that term. Okay? Could be perfect.
Scientific theory with a lot of metaphysical implications, however, as most scientific theories have metaphysical implications, some of them stronger than others.
Perfectly posited. We need to actually show that the strings themselves refer to an actual underlying physical substance. So we have that problem there.
Well, in string theory, the strings themselves would be some sort of physical entity. Yeah.
Well, I'm going on what we actually have, though, which is in quantum field theory. And as of now, we have no reason to posit some sort of underlying substance there. It's just information.
Well, quantum fields might not be a substance or a substrate per se, but they are still physical entities. They are physically real. Even if you wanted to say, well, they're just merely information, one could just say, yeah, and information is physical. Again, that informational structural realism takes information to be something physically real. Now,
Information.
again, I'm not saying that IP holds to that view, but if somebody held this view that information is this the fundamental structure of reality, they're probably going to hold to some flavor of an informational structural realism. I hold the ontic structural realism, a particular variant of it called moderate structural realism.
At the bottom point, which would align more with an idealist perspective, and specifically a theistic idealist perspective. Now, to be clear, many of the physicists I quoted, I'm not saying they're theists. I'm saying the implications of what they're saying, though, better aligns with theism.
I don't think that's true. As I said earlier, I just want to see the probability calculus on that. I think that, again, I think one can be an idealist and a naturalist. Bernardo Kastrup is an idealist and a naturalist, at least last I heard from like 4 years ago. So I would want to hear the argument for why idealism, or see the probability calculus on why idealism is more probable given theism than naturalism.
So again, if there is some sort of underlying physical thing that explains all of reality, then we need evidence for that. And then we also need to know why it is non-sentient. If the underlying foundation of reality is able to create a complex universe, it can't be acted upon. It has to
Well, but that assumes that it creates a universe.
somehow act on its own to bring about the universe. It sounds an awfully lot like God. That's my point. And of course, we talked a little bit about the quantum cognition correlation. To recap, gave a couple different points here. Actually, it was the Franco Vazza and Felitti argument that we see the way the brain is is similar to the cosmic web of galaxies. Now, Vazza and Felitti are basically saying that, Bernardo Kastrup by extension, saying that, look, idealism says the brain or the body is just the emergent picture of what you look like as a conscious agent. If you're in a physical space-time, you look like something, it's going to look like a brain or you by extension. Likewise, if idealism is true and the universe emerges from a mind, the brain itself would be the physical appearance in the same way your brain is the physical appearance of you. Now, in response to that, he said it's arranged in the most efficient way. Well, I mean, there are many ways to arrange efficiency. We have created very complicated computers and now quantum computers that are not arranged in the way our brains are arranged. So network efficiency is not necessary in the current way that our brain are designed. So we need another reason as to why the structure is the way it is and why it resembles mind. Just being network efficiency.
But the cosmos only aesthetically resembles the physical structure of a brain. And when you actually look at the physical structure of a brain under a microscope and all that, the similarity breaks down a little bit, but you can still grant them the similarity. It's merely aesthetic. It's not that's it. That doesn't really mean anything.
I agree. Now I want to ask, why does the universe on a godless view have to have network efficiency? What's the point of that? This is an arbitrary assumption. This is another brute fact being posited here. Whereas it's theism, as I pointed out, we're positing a far less brute facts, which is important. So again, what I'm arguing is I'm saying that on theism, we have a well-rounded explanation that can account for multiple lines of data, as I presented in my opening statement, and it's a very simple and parsimonious explanation. Now, he did talk about simplicity. He might get to a specified complexity argument coming up. If he does that, though, he's going to have to take that to its logical extreme and posit solipsism. Because why posit beyond himself complex minds when he could just posit them as figments of his own mind's imagination? Sometimes positing complexity is necessary. For example, physicists posit a multiverse to explain fine-tuning. That is vastly complex to just explain the fine-tuning. So just positing complexity is not wrong. We have to posit something that accounts for all the data. And sometimes we have to posit things that are more complex. This is why we got quantum mechanics. Newtonian physics wasn't accounting for all the data. We had to come up with something else. Physicists posit a multiverse. Why? Because of complexity, fine-tuning that needs explained. So we need to have an explanation that accounts for all the data. And I would say, given the data, the best explanation is a mind. And I can argue that the mind itself, from philosophers like Richard Swinburne, Dr. Joshua Sijuwati, actually has a very simple ontology. Again, it's just perfect being theism. We don't have to posit complex parts because the mind is not composed of physical parts. So it's actually a much simpler explanation. I hope we get more into that because there's more I want to talk about. Finally, you said consciousness is a process. Question, who am I talking to? How's that different than talking to a river or an avalanche?
I don't understand this objection here. So because consciousness is a process, therefore all processes are conscious? Like, I don't know what the objection is here. Digestion is also a process. Are you saying that digestion is like a river?
No, consciousness, if it were just processes, this is a meaningless conversation. There's no agents here. He brought
Well, that doesn't follow.
up the is-ought problem, but he said he only talked about hypothetical imperatives. Yeah, no one denies that hypothetical imperatives can be explained naturally, but we're talking about moral oughts. And you can't get around that. This is why I brought up the open question argument, because I can just ask, why is something natural good? And this also doesn't account for the argument I gave, which is that when we look at the very ontology of moral values and duties, objective goodness, it's personal in nature, which is what we call God.
Well, I don't think morality has like an ontology. I think it's like a conceptual thing. That's just me, though.
So why would the very ontology of moral values and duties appear to be personal and not also be God? It doesn't, it seems like, again, we need another ad hoc explanation to account for that. But I think I'm out of time, so I'll just yield the last few seconds. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. That rebuttal session. We'll switch over to Dr. Carrier for his 10-minute rebuttal as well. The floor is yours.
All right. So do we have a better explanation for the data? And that is actually what the point that I made. Let's go back through them. Precedent. So when we look at how things end up getting explained in the past 2,000 years of what we've done in terms of explaining the world, the least likely explanation is always supernatural. The most likely explanation is natural. So we have the background of precedent saying that any further thing that we need to explain is more likely, based on precedent, to have a natural explanation. That's item number one. That's why naturalism has one epistemic merit to it on that point. Then there's simplicity. I'm glad Michael asked about this. So where are we getting this simplicity idea? So if you look at like fine tuning or something like that, it's either a lucky universe or a lucky God. Can you tell me which one is more lucky? So a lucky universe would just have a finite specified complexity because the universe is not infinite. The actual structure of the universe fundamentally is very simple relative to a God's mind, for example. So the universe is actually less lucky than God because God actually has infinite specified complexity. So if you think of like all the possible arrangements of knowledge, including one piece of false information versus a million pieces of false information, different kinds of false information, and God is supposed to know everything, or at least everything it's possible to know, which it would give you a number of connections that is equal to Aleph Omega in terms of infinity. It's the highest possible cardinality of infinity. The thing is that God is only one item out of all possible infinite options. So if you're going to randomly pick a mind or a universe or something like that, almost all of them are going to have false information, less information, et cetera. They're not going to be a God mind. There's only one option that is God that's absolutely perfect to every connection, to every single thing that he has in his mind, every memory, every piece of reasoning, every connection he makes between two things. Every single thing has to be perfect. There's only one to a field of options of infinite. In fact, Aleph Omega infinite, super infinite. So the probability, the simplicity of God is not there. God is literally the most complex thing, is the highest specified complexity that anything can have, possibly. And so you'd have to explain why that exists. Whereas a lucky universe has a finite specified complexity and it's vastly less. So it's infinitely more likely, infinitely more simple by any system that you choose. So you can pick any kind of starting cosmology, Guth or Vilenkin. They have different models that start with very simple principles. Entails multiverses, by the way. They don't just posit multiverses. They start with a simple set of physical rules and principles, way simpler than God's mind, way simpler than God's power, simpler than anything you could think of. It's one of the simplest things that you can get. Now, it's not like one digit simple, but it is simple compared to God. And when you start with that assumption, then you get multiverses, and therefore you get universes like ours, because fine-tuning is washed out by so many replications. So with a very simple model, and that's what populates cosmological science today. There's no God theories in cosmological science because none of them actually have this epistemic virtue of being based on precedent and actually having this simplicity. So that's why our explanation actually is vastly simpler than the God explanation. And there's no way to like get God to sort of magically be more likely out of this, because we would need something like an absolute proof that there's no possible way God couldn't exist. And philosophers will tell you that no one has really successfully done that. Now, there's actually one particular model. I have an article called "What if we theorize?" I can't remember the exact title, but it's "What if we imagine nothing as a field state?" And there, I actually cite scientists in a published paper. It's Lincoln and Wasser. So if you go there, you can find the Lincoln Wasser paper about creation ex nihilo in dark matter physics. And they show that you can start with a very, very simple set of assumptions. In other words, you start with the assumption that there are no physical laws yet. The inevitable result you can work out deductively is unstable. So that state without any physical laws means there's no laws to keep it that way. It can't stay nothing because there's no law that says or forces it to stay nothing. So it's actually extremely unstable and has to collapse. And so what they show is that when that happens, you end up with something like a Guth or Vilenkin model, where you end up with some sort of simple multiverse cosmology that starts from a very simple beginning that collapses out of nothing naturally, inevitably. And it's entirely logically coherent. It has just very few posits to get it to do that. It's probably one of the simplest models that I've seen in terms of cosmology. And it's certainly way simpler. Just assume a few statements and it entails everything that we observe. And that's way simpler than God. Just saying we just have God for no reason. God is a way more complex thing. So we have no precedent for God, and God is way more complex than we need an explanation to be. Those are the reasons that we need to get rid of that concept. Okay, so that's that. How much time do I have?
Perfect. Fine. A little bit less than that.
Okay. All right, so let's rush through these. I've got a ton of time. So we get to the, really quickly go back over the consciousness point. Remember, the brain has to be a complex machine. Remember, it evolves slowly over time. Remember that we know the parts are necessary. The actual working parts are necessary for each piece of qualia that we experience in our consciousness. These are all things that would be absolutely expected. In fact, they would have to be the case if naturalism is true. Surprise, surprise, that's what we observe. But they're not necessary if God exists. God wouldn't even use this mechanism. But even if he had some reason to, you can't prove that it's 100% chance that he would choose this way of doing it as opposed to all the ways that he has, whereas this is conveniently the only way it could be if naturalism is true. So it starts to look weird why God is creating the universe in exactly the way that looks like a universe without a God in it. And you can show this with cosmology, with fine-tuning, with biogenesis, over and over again. All of the things turn out exactly the way we would expect, the only way that it would be if naturalism was true, but not the way it would, not certainly the way it would be if God were doing it. So that's why that argument actually holds up and actually hits the third principle, which is evidence is more expected on naturalism. The same evidence Michael's referring to, when we put the evidence he leaves out back in, it ends up where we get evolution of the brain anatomy, the brain's complexity, its necessity, each part of necessity for each part of consciousness. All of that is evidence that is more likely on naturalism. So that's why we get to that. And when we get to the things like what is the difference between a river and a mind, they're both processes. Obviously, different processes work with different causal systems. The brain is arranged in a particular way to have a particular causal system that a river is not arranged in that way. This is entirely physics, so there's not really anything I have to explain there. Different processes work differently because they're arranged physically differently to have different causal effects throughout them, and that's pretty simple to do. And we can show that also with the cosmology, the organization of galaxies. I didn't say that we just posit that they're seeking thermodynamic efficiency. What I meant was that you can actually do the math and show that it is an inevitable outcome. When you start the system and it inevitably condenses into that structure through deterministic physics. So there's no like posit or assumption about this. This is just an inevitable process. Once you have the starting rules, the end result is inevitable. It requires no intelligent assembly or design. And also with string theory, the model that I used just now was where waves, ripples in space-time itself, not strings. So in fact, he said there's no underlying physical substance. Well, the physical substance underlying everything is space-time itself on that model. This is a different model than, for example, quantum field theory, which has space-time being emergent. The superstring camp actually thinks space-time is fundamental and fields are emergent. And if you take that position, then what is fundamental to everything is space-time. That's actually everything. All particles, all fields, all force fields, everything is just twistings of space-time, and it explains everything that we have. So we can reduce everything that way. That's at the basement, space-time is all there is, and so on. And then all you need is what can expand space-time, what can twist it up, and so on. And that's when we get to Lincoln-Wasser, and that's where we get Guth and Vilenkin, and so on. We have all these cosmological theories that work. They're fine. He asks to defend the nothing argument. I don't have time to go into the specifics of it, but the nothing argument is similar to that Lincoln-Wasser argument that I mentioned before, which is that once you define a state of nothing correctly, where there's no laws governing what will happen, it inevitably happens that everything has an equal probability. But that does not mean that you're going to get everything. So I think this is a confusion that Michael is making. He mentioned Death Stars and rabbits earlier. Actually, so like if you were to pick of all random universes, every possible one, infinitely many different arrangements, Death Stars and rabbits they're like infinitely improbable. They're like the least likely things that you'll ever get. If you pick randomly several from there, most of the things you're going to pick are going to be sort of messy, semi-messy, complicated universes like ours. So there's not really a problem with rabbits and Death Stars. That's not really a thing. The issue is that when you look at fields of probability, if you're randomly picking from there, eventually you're going to pick a universe like ours, sufficiently like ours, relevantly like ours. You're not going to pick rabbits and Death Stars. They're extremely improbable compared to the fields of things. And that's because it's the specific different ways to configure the universe to produce life is actually, there are infinitely many ways to do that. And so you're not picking one thing out of an infinite array. You're actually picking randomly from all of that stuff. And we get to the moral oughts. What is the question? Hypothetically, Michael agrees hypothetical imperatives are empirical physical facts. Moral oughts are just the imperatives that you ought to.
Did he? I mean, I think that's kind of ridiculous. I think empirical facts are descriptive, not prescriptive.
Follow over all other oughts, and so you get to moral theory in terms of reciprocity and so on. Time, you said? Yeah.
That's right. Thank you very much for that rebuttal. And now we're going to go into our final rebuttal. These are only 5 minutes. Got the timer set for you. Mike, the floor is all yours.
All right, a lot to get through. So he says space-time is the underlying thing. Well, then we need to start asking questions comparable to the God hypothesis. What type of relations, properties, or underlying terms? Is it one field? How many excitations? How complex is its geometry? Is it unlimited? How many properties? What do these properties have? Does it have any boundary conditions? Does it have arbitrary limits? These are all assumptions that go into a naturalistic explanation that need to be explained. Whereas with theism, we have a far less brute fact.
Actually, a lot of them don't need to be explained.
Facts. Just God is a perfect being who is unlimited, explains where value comes from. Very simple.
The thing with God is that everything ultimately is going to reduce to God's preferences. Why did God create a universe? Well, because he had some preference or desire to do it. Okay, well, why did God have that preference or that desire to create the universe? Well, maybe he had this other preference or desire that led to that desire that led to the creation of the universe. So either there's an infinite chain of desires or preferences or reasons, you might say, for why God acts, or there's just, well, no reason at all, which I would just take to be irrationality, or God's reasons for the way that he acts and why he's done things the way that he's done are just going to be brutally contingent. So it seems to me that theism is going to have brute contingencies no differently than naturalism is, assuming that somebody holds the brute contingency and not some form of like necessitarianism or something like that. So this idea that theism can avoid or evade, rather, these brute contingencies, I don't think so. Particularly if one thinks God has libertarian free will, because then if his decisions go back infinitely, I think that's just not explanatorily simple. The other option is that all of God's reasons could just be necessary, but then I don't know in what sense. Then I think that just commits one to some form of necessitarianism. Or God doesn't have any reasons, and then he's just irrational, The only other option that I can imagine is that God's reasons are just brutally contingent. That's just the way that those are just the reasons that God has. But you're still positing God alongside those brute contingencies. Or you could just say that the fundamental gnomic structure of reality, the fundamental parameters and values and boundary conditions and all that stuff, those are just brutally contingent. That at the fundamental level, at least, reality just is that way. And I don't have to posit anything else alongside those brute contingencies because, again, naturalism is intrinsically simpler than theism in virtue of the fact that it posits at least one less ontic thing. Namely, it doesn't posit the existence of God.
Simple. He said Death Stars and rabbits are improbable, but again, according to his own research, he says and he just said there are infinitely many things that can come out of the nothing state. So how could he say they are improbable? What in nothing, your nothing state that gives rise to the universe, what in there makes this kind of rule that says Death Stars and rabbits are more improbable? Nothing. So you unfortunately, it appears you're contradicting yourself there. And again, nothing cannot produce everything or something. His nothing state is completely illogical. It cannot give rise to anything because there is no things there to cause. So but he said,
yeah, this is another objection that some people raise to the PSR. The principle of sufficient reason, that at least basically the idea that all contingent facts necessitate some sort of reason sufficient for their contingency. Because obviously theists are going to want to posit, generally speaking, that God has some sort of libertarian free will. I mean, they're not going to think that he doesn't have free will. Maybe you might find a theist here or there that might think that. And they're certainly not going to want to take some sort of compatibilist view because that would suppose there's something external to God that influences the decisions that he makes. But again, if you posit that God has libertarian free will, then either God's reasons are just there's just an infinite chain of reasons, each being adduced to explain the reason that precedes it. There are no reasons for God's action, in which case God is just an irrational being, or there's going to be, or God's reasons are just necessary, which is going to commit you to some form of necessitarianism. If all of God's reasons are necessary and couldn't have been otherwise, what sense does God make decisions about things? Or God's reasons are just brutally contingent. And it seems that if you want to posit God as libertarian free will, the easiest one of those four to accept is going to be that God's reasons are God just has those reasons, that they're just brutally contingent. But then that seems to go against the notion of the PSR, that all contingent facts, say God's reasons in this instance, require some sort of sufficient reason for why they are the way that they are rather than some other way. And so it seems that, so this is actually a really good point, that if God has libertarian free will, that seems to suggest that one can't be committed to a PSR, or at least not any strong version of a PSR. Maybe they might try to formulate some weak version of the PSR that still allows God to have libertarian free will. But that is an objection that is often brought to the PSR, is that, well, if God has libertarian free will, then it seems that you're going to be committed to some sort of undesirable view with respect to what informs God's reasons.
Somehow nothing collapses to nothing naturally. What? That doesn't make any sense. Nothing is nothing. It doesn't collapse into anything. He brought up the paper, Spontaneous Creation of Universe Ex Nihilo.
This is one of the objections, that God's reasons are just necessary. But it seems then that this is no different than some mere mechanistic process. This just must necessarily occur. And then it just seems that there isn't any desire, volition, or will involved. And then I don't see why at that point we need to posit that this would be an agent of any sort. It could just be some natural mechanism where this must just necessarily happen. And then at that point, I don't see why we should even call it a God. And so I just did this objection just seems, again, it seems to the whole argument, just you could just run a reductio against it.
Cited, but what they're saying actually more aligns with my view. I'm not saying they're theists, but I mean, they say the notion of bit-based information at the core of the universe evolvement is not new. This trend suggests that the physical world is made of information with energy and matter as incidental. So they're not saying the universe came out of nothing. They're saying it came out of information processing, which is not nothing, it's something. And that's more in line with the idealist perspective. I'm not saying they're going that far, but I'm saying this is not in line with his nothing state. It doesn't even logically follow. He said that God is so complex, why posit that? Well, again, now you have to just posit solipsism. Because if you're gonna say we need to just go with the simple, you should just posit your mind, and we're all figments of your mind's imagination. Why posit a bunch of extra?
But again, simplicity or parsimony simplicator isn't what we want to look at. Sure, maybe solipsism is the most parsimonious view, but that doesn't. It has a very, very shallow explanatory scope. It just doesn't account for a lot of the things that we experience and a lot of the seemings and intuitions, if you want to use that language, that humans have about the world. It might be the simplest view, but it's not the most explanatory view. It doesn't really provide for meaningful explanations, and that's why it should be rejected. So again, parsimony simplicator is not what matters. You need to consider parsimony, but you also don't want to sacrifice all of your other theoretical virtues for parsimony alone, as I said earlier.
Extra complex minds out there, billions on this planet, if we just are going with simplicity here. It's more about parsimony. Now, again, you could say his explanation is simple, but it's not explaining things. It just is. Okay. We still need to account for why the universe exists, why brains somehow produce consciousness.
I can reject that. In virtue of rejecting a PSR, I can say that there is no reason why the universe exists. The universe just brutally exists. It's just there, and that's all.
Why there is moral realism in many other aspects. This is not an actual.
One can just reject moral realism.
Full explanation at this point. So that needs to be talked about. And again, positing complexity is not wrong. We do this all the time in science to explain phenomena we see. But again, if we read, for example, many philosophers like Gage and Doherty, they say this, but of course, many theologians have thought that God must not reason decursively as we reason, but in a simpler manner. Following Augustine Aquinas, thinks that God knows everything that can be known in a single timeless act and as a single all-conjunctive thought. Dawkins could quibble with the theology, but this just shows that one simply can't do philosophy of religion without doing theology. And he does not seem ready or willing or able to do the requisite theology. Also, Swinburne argues that some in detail, that attributing infinite power is simpler than attributing a finite quality, and illustrates this from the history of science. So it's much actually simpler as form of an ontology to posit a being that's just unlimited in power, knowledge, goodness, than having some sort of arbitrary limit. Why does it only go this far? Well, you need an explanation for that. So when we posit perfect being theism, as Brian Leftow, Joshua Sijiwati has pointed out, this is a very simple ontology. You're just positing a mind that's unlimited.
But it's not simpler than naturalism, because both theists and naturalists can agree that the natural world does exist, and that we can know that. But at least honest theists and naturalists will acknowledge that while people might believe, even strongly believe, and we could even grant that there are good reasons to think that there is a God, we don't know that there's a God the way that we know there's a natural world. So the naturalist says, well, then that natural world is just all that's there. The theist says, well, the natural world is there. There's one thing. The second one, and there is also this being as God. So 2 for the theist, 1 for the naturalist. Naturalism is intrinsically simpler than theism because it posits at least one less thing than the theist does, namely God.
So, for example, to give an analogy, many centuries ago, people used to think that you just keep going faster, infinite speed. Well, that's just a reasonable assumption until we found an actual limit with Einstein for like the speed of light, for example. We have a reason to posit a limit, but without that, there's no reason to posit a limit. That is a simpler explanation that's more parsimonious. Same with God. God is a simple explanation, although a simple ontology. That of the mind can have a complex thought or do complex things. It's still a simple ontology, which can account for the data that we have in a much better way than positing something like space-time somehow is the explanation, but it also appears emergent, appears to come from a mind, somehow creates conscious minds and moral realism, and has all these weird arbitrary limits, arbitrary properties. This is about a very complicated explanation. We can't confuse explanation and ontology with the actions or the beyond that kind of aspect of it. So again, it's about a simple ontology. As philosophers have noted, the mind has a very simple ontology. And again, we can account for all this data. Unfortunately, when it comes to the data I presented, we still have not got a better explanation that can account for all the data I presented in a more parsimonious manner.
Thank you very much for that 5-minute rebuttal. Final rebuttal. 5 minutes from Dr. Richard Carrier. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll start with the last one. I think again, Michael's misunderstood the argument. So let me give it in a different form. So let's say you have a collection of all possible things. It's infinite, and there's every possible God is in there. Every possible godless world is in there, and if you look at like the possible worlds, and there could be a world that you choose that has one universe in it only, a world that you choose that has no universes, that would be nothing, and nothing stays nothing. Or you could pick out of that hat essentially a mass, 10,000 universes or whatever, the number of universes that exist, the multiverse you pick out of there. All these possibilities are in there. Any one of them could be any possible multiverse or single verse and so on. But if you look at, when you pick through all of that, the probability of picking a zero universe, in other words, nothing, is infinity to 1 against, right? Picking one single universe by itself, also infinity to 1 against. And even picking either one of those, 0 or 1, is also infinity to 1 against, because there's always an infinite number of larger multiverses to pick. So in fact, if you pick at random out of that hat, you are going to almost certainly pick a godless multiverse.
Oh.
Because of all the possible things that are in there. That's the most common thing by far. There's infinitely more of those things and more rare things like a God. Now, God has infinite specified complexity, because he has absolutely he's literally Aleph Omega. You can look this up, of all the connections that he could possibly make in his mind to be omnipotent or to be omniscient, is the most specified complexity that you can even have. It's like nothing can be logically more complex than that, and more specified complex than that. But there's only one of those. Out of all the things in the hat, only one of those is that God. But almost all, in fact, infinitely many in that hat, are godless multiverses. So if you're picking at random, you're not going to get a God. You're to an infinity to 1, you're going to get a random godless multiverse of vast size. And so the Lincoln-Wasser model, they don't actually have any positing of limits. There's no ad hoc anything in there. They just say that if you start with a state that has no physical laws governing what will happen, it logically necessarily follows that what will happen will be random. It'll be a random pick out of that hat. And they build this out in terms of describing in terms of field theory. There are no assumptions that are plugged in there. Nothing's ad hoc. It's just simply, once you define the state, the conclusion follows necessarily. And I bring this out in my many articles about this, but the best one to start with is nothing is a field state, is where I talk about Lincoln-Wasser and tie it into my other argument. So if you're picking at random, you're going to get a multiverse, and therefore it's actually a much simpler explanation. God is a much more complex piece of information. So Swinburne was actually wrong about that. So that argument doesn't work. It actually works the other way around. God is actually the most complex thing that you can pick. A multiverse is the least complex because of all the random things that you could pick at random. And that's the simplest thing you can do, is pick at random. You're not specifying.
I think neither of them is the simplest. I think positing the existence of the natural world, and only the natural world that we all know and agree exists, is the simplest in terms of ontology, at least. Well, one of the simplest in terms of ontology. In terms of ontology, while still accounting for the things we needed to account for, it's the simplest.
Specifying anything, it is zero specificity. You're picking at random, you're going to get a godless multiverse of all the possible things in that hat. So that's why I'm saying that's a simpler. So it also hits precedent. Again, we have no precedent for supernatural causes. God is the least likely explanation for anything you run into. It's always been thousands and thousands, millions and millions of things have been explained with natural causes. And so the probability is going to be one of these natural causes. Lincoln-Wasser is an example of this. So we got precedent. Then we've got simplicity. The Lincoln-Wasser model is vastly simpler, has vastly fewer posits, and requires less specificity of choice in terms of what happens than the God hypothesis does. And so I do want to revisit, what's my time on that?
121.
Okay, let's see if I can get through the moral argument, because I think he mentioned that a little bit, and I should hit that some. So let's do the same thing I did before. Let's put all the evidence in that Michael's leaving out. So atheism predicts that moral rules will only come from human beings, and thus will begin deeply flawed and will be improved by experiment over a really long time, each improvement coming after empirically observing the social chaos and dissatisfaction and waste that comes from flawed moral systems. Atheism also predicts that will happen only slowly over thousands of years, because humans are imperfect reasoners. And that is exactly what we observe. Just look at the examples of endorsing slavery and the subordination of women in the Bible, 1 Timothy 2, for example. By contrast, theism predicts a universe directly governed by justice laws, or a kind and just stewardship, or the enacting and teaching of divine justice and mercy everywhere from the start. But we observe no such laws built into the universe, no stewards or law enforcers but us, and no perfect moral code has existed anywhere throughout history. The best moralities have always just slowly evolved from human trial and error. That's exactly what we would have to observe if God doesn't exist.
I don't think it's like super strong evidence for anti-realism, but I do think it is some evidence for anti-realism that like moral values have changed quite drastically, even over time, and change in ways that are like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like that are proportionate to like the technological development and the change in cultural and social and economic relations that we have and what have you.
Exist, but it doesn't.
Which I guess I just think seems to suggest that morality is fundamentally rooted in the preferences that agents have and not in any facts about like the world or something like that.
Weird. It is not what we expect to observe if God did exist. If God did exist, we should see perfect moralities taught from the beginning for the last 40,000 years or 2,000, 4,000 years of writing and so on. And so that's why morality establishes my position.
Thank you very much. We have the 20-minute open dialogue. Got the timer set. The floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Carrier. Question about what you said there. You said pick something out of a hat. Are you talking about your nothing state?
Yeah, I'm responding to your discussion of my nothing state. Yeah.
Okay, so you pick
the unstable nothing model. Yeah.
The unstable nothing. What is unstable in nothing?
So, yeah, if you want to get into that now, I'm assuming you know the answer to this, but so
I'm probably going to call it there because they just kind of rehash everything we've already talked about in the last 2 hours. And there weren't with the Q&A, there weren't any questions I particularly considered interesting that I really want to talk about here. So I guess I'll leave it there. I'm also getting kind of hungry. I want to eat. I still got a shower and it's 6 o'clock here already. So we'll leave it there. I think I do think that was actually a really good debate. I think it was very civil, very cordial, very, very respectful between the two of them. I do think Richard made a few good points. There are some things I wish he would have done more to present like a positive case for naturalism rather than just sort of start off by responding to the arguments that Mike gave. But I do think that there were some good points that Richard made. You know, the arguments that IP gave, IP's been using these arguments for a number of years now. I don't think they're horrible arguments. I think they're worth listening to. They're worth engaging with. There's something different than like the everyday arguments you normally get from people discussing these things in natural theology. So I also think that IP is a formidable debate opponent. I think if you're going to be debating Mike, you need to come prepared because he's going to be prepared. And I think Richard was reasonably prepared. I don't think Richard's performance was like bad here. You know, like I said, there are some things that I wish he would have done that he didn't. But overall, I think that he made some pretty good points. I really wish he would have hammered the precedent point a little bit more than he did, just because I do think that's actually a really, really good point in favor of naturalism, is that like when we explain things, we don't ever need non-natural stuff to do it. Anyways, guys, I'll leave you there to finish off the rest of your Thanksgiving weekend and enjoy the rest of this delightful Sunday. Delightful probably for some of you. If you're in the Midwest like I am, we got hammered with a bunch of snow this weekend, so it hasn't been super, super delightful here. But you know, it is what it is. We can't control the weather, even though there are people that think that we can. And with that, I will leave you guys to enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. Take care.